Hello, everybody. I'm Rob Wallace here in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm an evolutionary epidemiologist with the People's CDC, here with an update on the COVID-19 pandemic. This week, we'll cover the state of global COVID, the state of US COVID, and the Inter-imperial Rivalry that's helping drive the failure to control the pandemic. We begin with global COVID. In the graph in red, the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center reports another sharp increase to 7.7 million new COVID cases worldwide for the week ending July 24th. That's more cases than any other COVID wave so far, except Omicron this past winter. The number of global weekly deaths there in white underwent another increase to 15,900 deaths this past week, although still less than in all the previous wave. In green, we see an increase to 95 million new vaccinations administered this week worldwide. This New York Times map shows hotspots over the past week in the Americas, Europe, Asia, and Australasia. They are in purple: France, Germany, Austria, Italy, Greece, Serbia, Costa Rica, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Australia, and New Zealand continue to be epicenters in average daily new cases per 100,000 population. Georgia turned into a new hotspot. Bolivia, Moldova, Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia, Iran, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia hosted increases in caseload. Mexico, Brazil, Iceland, Norway, Portugal, Ireland, the UK, Belgium, Switzerland, Tunisia, and Botswana exhibited declines in caseloads. Here's a 7-day average of daily confirmed COVID cases per million people from the beginning of the outbreak on the left all the way to today on the right. We see the spikes in cases when Omicron first emerged in late 2021. The present hotspots we noted in the previous map are trending in different directions. Taiwan, Italy, the UK's outbreaks appear in decline. Greece and Costa Rica are continuing to host large spikes. Austria, Serbia, Georgia, Japan, and South Korea are hosting new surges. Australia, New Zealand, France, and Germany continue to cycle through their months-long epidemics. The US and Brazil reporting slow but steady increase. We see that none of the countries highlighted, all there in gray, are reporting national testing data as of July 3rd. Here we have COVID deaths per million people for these same countries. We see a recent overall swoosh upwards coming out of the lull of post-war Omicron for our countries here leading in case incidence. The individual trajectories and deaths here are different than for caseload. Costa Rica, New Zealand, Greece, Australia, the United Kingdom, and Serbia are showing demonstrable increases in deaths per population. Taiwan appears the only country in this group showing a concerted decline in deaths, although still at a comparatively high level. The other countries, France on down here, appear in a steady state of deaths. The pandemic is, after all, a moving target. The virus continues to evolve. Here's next strain's family tree for COVID samples over the past 6 months, although rooted from the beginning of the pandemic at the center of the diagram and branching outward as SARS-2 evolved. We see in dark blues and purples the early variants like Alpha and Beta. In the light blue, we have samples of the Delta variant. We see over the past 6 months that multiple Omicron subvariants, they're in yellow, BA1 and 2, in light and medium oranges, BA4 and 5, and the darker orange, BA.2.12, are continuing to explore SARS-2's evolutionary space. Indeed, we see in the single red sample the arrival of subvariant BA2.75, or the Torres variant found first in India in June. Across the Omicron group, we find molecular changes from the root of the SARS-2 tree onward, numbering as high as 62 amino acid changes. That's in the new Torres variant, and 16 deletions. What that all means is that the virus continues to evolve, along the way experimenting with the human immune system to the tune of nearly 8 million new infections a week during what governments worldwide are treating as the end of the pandemic. We see that hospital admissions are up in most of the countries in our highlighted set reporting such data. These appear a function of a surge in caseloads, the reemergence of deadlier subvariants such as BA5, and as we have talked about previously on COVID this week, a developing mismatch between Omicron and COVID vaccines. We also see across countries in our set a near global retraction in non-pharmaceutical interventions since Omicron. These indices of the stringency of public health measures show that some countries at first attempted to differentiate masking mandates and the like for the vaccinated, they're in green, and for the non-vaccinated in brown, before largely abandoning that distinction. That combo, evolving subvariants probing our defenses and a willful public health surrender, does not bode well for this winter's likely surge. One can't help but hypothesize that the recent surges in some of the countries here are related to these rollbacks, including for Australia, France, Germany, Costa Rica, Georgia, New Zealand, Serbia, South Korea, and Taiwan. Turning to the US, we see much of the country still hosting a raised floor in COVID caseload. The Northeast and Upper Midwest are still characterized by a relative decline in COVID, but we also see the new surge underway in New Jersey and New York City is now found in Pennsylvania. The surge in Appalachia has really blown up in West Virginia and Kentucky. South continues to be hit hard, particularly in South and West Texas, northern Louisiana, across Mississippi and Alabama, and now suddenly in North Carolina. As last week, we see the floor of caseloads raised across California, the Southwest, and county by county across the Plain States. Alaska and Puerto Rico continue to be hit badly. There are other ways of tracking COVID. The levels of SARS-2 virus detected in the wastewater that comes through our sewage plants, as reported here July 10th to the 24th, shows sewage plants in red representing loads at 80 to 100% more than their previously recorded levels. We see these scattered across the US for those plants reporting in California, Colorado, Texas, Illinois, Kentucky, and Western New York. We see new surges in Nebraska, Ohio, Georgia, and north of New York City and Western New York State. We see slight declines from last week in Oregon and a still hot Illinois. The cool blues of recorded lows in the Northeast continue to be infiltrated with increasing SARS loads there in orange. Over the past 15 days, we've seen the change in SARS detected in wastewater heating up in Utah, Oklahoma, Michigan, Ohio, Louisiana, Georgia, Virginia, and New York downstate and up. Much of Colorado, Illinois, Indiana, and North Carolina are signaling a cooling off. To sum up, we see almost the entire country, 94% of US counties, filled in at the highest level of community transmission, including what were previously retracting sites a month ago in Iowa, Pennsylvania, and New York State. And as on the global stage, SARS-2 continues to evolve here in the US. We see here new variants first emerging and then dominating in cycles of every 2 months. The BA.2 Omicron variant in pink was replaced by the BA.2.12 subvariant in orange, which is now being replaced by subvariants BA.4 and 5 in green, with BA.5 surging ahead to account for 82% of new cases. So the pandemic continues to turn here in the United States, and there are consequences of pretending otherwise. In our May 5th report, COVID This Week warned of such consequences as they play out across social groups. Quote, the present outbreaks of COVID in New York City are largely concentrated in wealthier neighborhoods. For instance, Lower Manhattan and Riverdale in the Bronx, where many people are pretending COVID is over. These outbreaks are likely to spill over into poorer neighborhoods with people without similar resources in health, money, and time off, end quote. We see New York City's map today there on the right with heavy caseloads now in blacker, browner, and poorer neighborhoods, as we warned, from Lower East Side to Harlem, much of non-Riverdale Bronx, and deep into Queens and southern Brooklyn. A report just posted by a team at the Boston University School of Public Health shows that Black and Latino populations have suffered the worst COVID death rates compared to white populations across US regions there along the side and across urban and rural settings there across the top. The disparity was worse in the first year of the pandemic there in blue, but even upon vaccination held in place the second year there in orange, particularly in the metropolitan regions, of which our New York City example is one. If that disparity narrowed in rural regions, it's because white populations were killed more by COVID in the second year when vaccines were available than in the first. We end this week's COVID This Week by returning to our time series of the Stringency Index, marking the state of countries' efforts to control COVID with multiple interventions. We see here, while many of the countries undergoing recent spikes in BA.5-driven caseloads rolled back their non-pharmaceutical interventions, China remains on a steady diet of such measures. These efforts, often targeted to the worst hit epicenters, continue on to the consternation of many of the country's manufacturing end buyers in the global north. Indeed, the New York Times business section has gone to a veritable war with China's zero COVID policy, pretending its objections are about something else. Tech specialist Li Yuan has written a series of articles to the effect that zero COVID threatened the global economy and the Chinese people, comparing the campaign to the Holocaust and public health workers in China to Nazis. Yuan had also compared zero COVID to Mao's Zero Sparrow campaign, which, Yuan wrote, led to insect infestations and the Great Famine. Why such gutter snark? It's a signifier of a desperate moment in US statecraft and the socio-spatial limits of capital. As historian Adam Tooze explains, both China's identity as much of the world's supplier of last resort and its initial successes in COVID control made it also conservative in pandemic economic policy. China wasn't beholden to anxious multinationals bottled up all along their suddenly brittle supply line. and there's less chance of capital engaging in a spatial fix that is pivoting to other suppliers elsewhere during a global shutdown. What is the point of the great labor arbitrage China represents? US corporations and their media representatives are complaining, if its government won't just sacrifice its workforce, its populace, during a pandemic in the interests of the greater commodity good. Geographer David Harvey described the structural sources of such a crisis of faith. Quote, at times of savage devaluation, interregional rivalries typically degenerate into struggles over who is to bear the burden of devaluation. The export of unemployment, of inflation, of idle productive capacity becomes the stakes in the game. Trade wars, dumping, interest rate wars, restrictions of capital flow and foreign exchange, immigration policies, colonial conquest, the subjugation and domination of tributary economies, the forced reorganization of the division of labor within economic empires, and finally, the physical destruction and forced devaluation of a rival's capital through war are some of the methods at hand, end quote. Indeed, the clashes around COVID that plaster our experience of the pandemic, both domestically and abroad, are markers of what Harvey identified as no mere anomalies, but constitutive moments in the dynamics of capital accumulation. There's an inner dialectic to be found at the point of ecological and epidemiological collapse, when the crises are pinned upon previous partners to mutual relief. Leaving 15 million to their COVID deaths is considered a necessary part of global capitalism's reconstitution, even at this precarious conjuncture, as we discussed last week, around deforestation and monkeypox, when the resources from which capital needs to smash and grab a reset is found beginning to run out. And that's COVID this week from the People's CDC. You can learn more about the People's CDC and read this week's COVID weather report at peoplecdc.org.